All right. Yeah. So as we go figure, somebody calls me the minute it's the way it always happens. So anyway, sort of the way I'd like for it to go is I've gone through the entire, purchase agreement and highlighted things that I felt were interesting, if not necessarily a change, things that were interesting that I wanted to point out. So I'd like to go through all of that. If you have questions that are related to what I'm working on, throw it in the chat or pipe up, because I'm not going to be able to see all of your faces. If you raise your hand or wave or do anything like that, I won't be able to see you. So get my attention either by putting a message in the chat or unmuting and just sort of piping up. And I'm absolutely positive that there are going to be questions that you all have that I don't come up with in this. I mean, basically, what I did is I read through it, and there were probably 24 things that I felt were important for me to share with all of you for things that I've been hearing lately. But if there's something that I don't address, at the end of it, pipe up and we'll discuss it and see if we can come to a solution by reviewing that part of the contract. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Everybody there. So it is 10 o'clock. Do you want to get started, Nicole? Especially since we're recording, we'll reward all of the people that were here on time today. So I will share my screen. See if I can do it the right way. Everybody able to see that? Yes, perfect. Okay, so what I wanted to start off with, the first thing, and I always say this just about every time, I talk about different contracts and everything, is read the contract. I mean, take the time, really to sit down and read through the contract and see what it says in there. I mean, there's been probably, 50 or 60 revisions of this contract in my career over the years. And, to be honest, I haven't read through some of it. So sometimes they make changes. And if you don't read through it, you're gonna miss out on some things. So I went through this time and the things that I highlighted, I think are important. So I'm going to talk about those first. And why they're significant. Up here at the top where it says brokers and agents are not parties to this agreement. I don't know if anybody is not aware of that, but we are not parties to the contract. I mean, the agreement is between the buyer and the seller. It has nothing to do with us. We are outside representatives that are acting on behalf of our clients, giving our clients representation, but we're not a party to it. So if there is a lawsuit over a contract, we don't really have any loss because we're not going to lose the property and we're not going to lose money necessarily because we didn't purchase a property. We're not a party to it. It's our clients that suffer the consequences for what it is that we do right or wrong. Now, having said that, even though we're not punished by a deal failing or by making a contractual mistake in the contract, we can find ourselves getting in trouble from our clients if we misrepresent something to our clients or if we fail to protect them and there's consequences. They can come back to us for negligence or not proper representation. So it's important to know that there are risks to our role in the contract, but we're not parties to it. The next paragraph, I highlighted most of it. It's regarding agency. The thing that I found to be interesting in it, and I haven't heard this question in a long time, but if you read in the second line, it says, if represented by a real estate licensee, buyer's agent is not legally required to give the seller's agent the agency disclosure form signed by the buyer. It used to be when we were auditing files all the time is that you had to have an agency agreement from the listing broker to the seller and the listing broker to the buyer, and the buyer had to get one from the buyer and the buyer's agent had to get one from the seller. All of that stuff is gone very clearly. It says that by signing this, everybody agrees that they've signed an agency disclosure and we're not required to give our agency disclosure to the other party. Make sense? I don't know if that's a question for anybody, but I thought that was a very interesting clause that is in there. If you read through it, that's what it means.
But
Uh,
we do anyway because it's part of the forms, and we usually just send the whole signed thing over. So it's not a big deal if we do anyway, right?
right. Well, when was the last time you got an agency disclosure signed by the seller from the listing broker?
Correct.
When
But
you
we
rep,
always seem to
yeah, when
send
you're,
it from the buyer side.
yeah, but it's not required. Yeah, I guess that's what I'm saying is it's not required by the contract. So, interesting how these things work. When you read through the contract, exactly what it is that you need to do. So the reason that I wrote in here unrepresented is with the new laws that we have with buyer agency. I don't know how often this is happening, but I believe that there are a lot of buyers that are going directly to listing brokers and saying, hey, write the deal. And some of those people are represented by the listing broker, creating dual agency, and some of them are not. If you end up you have a listing where the buyer comes to you and says, I want you to write a deal on your listing and I'm not paying you and I don't want you to be my agent. I don't want to pay you. You can do that. Okay, you can do that. And there's two things that you need to do. One is that when you prepare the purchase agreement and it's asking for the buyer's brokerage firm, if there's no broker representing the buyer, you need to write in unrepresented. Okay, because the buyer does not have an agency relationship with any broker. They can buy as a principal being unrepresented. But if you do this, if you're writing a deal and you put unrepresented in the purchase agreement, make sure you get the non-agency disclosure for the buyer signed, which says that you are working solely on behalf of the seller and that anything the buyer says, and does, you can share with the seller because your fiduciary duty is to the seller, not to the buyer. It's important that you have that document signed as well as putting unrepresented in here. That's probably a big change over the last 6 months. I don't hear it happening a lot, but if it does happen, that's the proper way to do it. Hope that makes sense for everybody. Okay. The next thing I wrote down here was agency. Agency. There's a couple of boxes here as if the buyer is represented by more than one brokerage, which basically means you could have somebody from Simi Valley, a brokerage in Simi Valley that sends their buyer up to you and says, we're both going to represent that person. Um, you would check this box and you would have to have an additional form adding them. The key here is when it says represents, more than one brokerage represents. And the key there is agency. The key there is agency. When you are an agent for a client, it means that you have a fiduciary duty to them. You're supposed to work in their best interest above all other people, even yourself. When you don't represent somebody as an agent, you only have to be fair and honest with them. Okay, so it's really important that when you are trying to figure out who you're representing or what documents need to be there or who the buyer is represented by, is their agent is anybody that has a signed written agreement with them and has a signed agency disclosure with them. Okay, go ahead, Maureen.
Um, that has nothing to do with if someone refers you to somebody,
That's
correct?
correct. Yeah.
So if it's
So
just a straight referral, we don't need to do this.
yes.
Thank you.
So if you get an incoming referral, and let's say that the agent is in Simi Valley and they're sending you a referral and you write the contract, the agent in Simi Valley does not have an agency relationship with the buyer. You do. So there's no ABA or any other agency involved there. You're sending a referral out of the relationship is between you and the referring broker. The relationship isn't between the buyer and the referring broker. Okay. Let's see. There was something else I was going to say about that. Maybe not. Okay, we'll come back to it if I remember. It seems really weird that I would highlight this, but this is a change. Line C, 33A, expiration of offer, 3 calendar days after all buyer signatures. That caught my attention. Usually, the days start upon delivery. So when you have a fully executed contract that is signed by all parties and delivered, that's usually when the times for contingencies start. That's the time when escrows start, but not in this contract. If you read it closely, the offer expires 3 calendar days after all buyer signatures. So if for some reason you were to have a purchase agreement signed by all of your buyers today, and you did not deliver the contract to the seller until Thursday at 5 o'clock, you would have an expired offer pretty quickly after you sent it, right? Couple days, or a day and a half. Okay. So that's important that you read through the details, because if you ever go to court, they're going to read the contract that is not what you thought it was. Okay. Next thing that I thought was interesting is this clause down here. It says if it's FHA or VA check, deliver list of lender required repairs within 17 days. So if you have a buyer that's getting a VA or an FHA loan, they're supposed to identify to the seller what the required repairs are by the seller. How many times do we do that now? Zero, right? We don't do that as a matter of course, but that's what the contract is asking us to do. If you know that your appraisal is not going to be done within 17 days, you may want to extend that time period from 17 to some other amount. Okay, but don't leave it blank, or else you'll be out of contract. You might have a seller or a seller's agent that sends you a notice to perform on day 17, and your appraisal isn't going to be done for another week. Okay, so it's important to know those deadlines. Okay. Any questions on that page from anybody? Okay, so here we go to page 2. When you go up to this top line here, G1, it says seller credit to buyer. This says for closing cost. So if you're asking for a credit for closing cost, this is where that number is going to go. Okay. It's not for anything else. It's for closing cost. In G2, it says additional seller credit terms does not include buyer broker compensation. So you don't put your 2.5% in here. You don't put your 3% in here. You don't put any of your compensation. This could be for repairs. This could be for a carpet allowance. I'm not sure what other credit other than repairs or carpet allowance and that kind of stuff or maybe a appliance credit could go in here. But it's certainly not your buyer broker compensation, and it's not closing costs. Closing costs are there. Other things go here. Here's where it gets into your fee. Okay, and I don't think this is really too different from what we've been talking about. Seller payment for buyer's obligation to compensate buyer's broker. I think it's important how these words read. Seller payment for buyer's obligation. The seller does not have an obligation to your fee. The buyer has an obligation to your fee. By checking this, the seller is agreeing to cover the buyer's obligation. You may not think it makes really too much difference who is obligated as long as I get paid, but it does if you ever go to court and you're trying to collect. Okay. Because the contract and making all of the T's crossed and the I's dotted is important to be able to enforce any contract. So it goes in here, seller agrees to pay out of the transaction proceeds, and I'm going to use the example of 3% because I like that number, of the final purchase price, and if applicable, probably most of the time, these things are going to be zero, toward the obligation. Again, it's reiterating the obligation of the buyer to compensate buyer's broker. But down here is important, and that's why I highlighted it. Buyer affirmatively represents that at the time this offer is made, buyer has a written agreement with buyer's broker. So they have to have a buyer broker compensation agreement in place and signed. It has to be valid. And it covers this property. So you could, if somebody had a buyer broker agreement for Simi Valley, but they were buying in Big Bear, it wouldn't be valid because it doesn't cover the property in Big Bear. Okay, so they're saying I have a valid buyer broker agreement with this agent who's representing me, and it covers the property that we're making the offer on. And here's really important, provides for compensation for no less than the amount stated above. So if if your buyer broker agreement says that the buyer is obligated to pay you 2.5%, and you put 3% in here, it invalidates the clause because the buyer is affirmatively representing that their fee on their buyer broker agreement is equal to or greater than what they're asking for. Okay. Go ahead, Nicole.
How would you know?
On the last page of the buyer broker agreement, there is a box that incorporates what all of the terms are. And if the listing broker and the seller require it, the buyer's broker is supposed to present it.
So you don't have to give it up. That
Not
page 5,
not unless it's asked for.
only if it's asked for. So there's nothing in this contract that said in the RPA that says you have to give it to them.
Nope, it's the buyer is affirmatively
Okay.
representing all of the things, and there's no requirement for them to provide you anything unless it's requested by the listing broker and the seller.
Okay.
And I think that's actually in the buyer representation agreement itself, that language. Okay. Okay, so here's another thing that keeps coming up, final verification of condition. I mean, it seems like VPs, verification of property conditions, seem to be just as problematic for a lot of transactions as everything else. You know, the contract says boilerplate, it's supposed to be delivered 5 days prior to close of escrow. It's pretty common practice for, from what I'm seeing, for people to do their VP the day before close or the day of close or maybe the weekend prior to close when it's closing on Friday. Most of the time, it's not being done 5 days in advance. So if you want to write a clean and clear contract, you might want to shorten that day up, because a listing broker, if you're representing a buyer, can issue you a notice to perform 8 days or 7 days prior to close and say, I want your VP 5 days prior to close. And if you're not, you could be out of contract and you're subject to cancellation. Right? Okay. It's a term of the contract. Okay. I don't know too many people that would cancel like that, but it's, if you understand how the contract works, you know how to make it work for your clients and against them. Let's say that your seller has a superior backup offer and they want you to get out of the first deal. If I have a seller that's got, $80,000 on the table with an offer coming in behind the one that's getting ready to close, and the seller says, Mark, do anything you can to get me out of this deal. I can go through this contract, issue a notice to perform. And if they don't issue me a VP, verification of property condition within the time frame, we can cancel.
I have a question on that.
Yep.
So what if the sellers aren't leaving the home until 2 days before the close of escrow? How do you go about, giving typically they're, the homes are not in pristine order when they're leaving.
Okay. Well,
There's a time if they, and that's in the event that there's the homeowner has been occupying the home.
well, and there's the final verification of walkthrough is contractually, as I just stated, is here at 5 days prior, unless you change it. So
on my template, Mark, it
Mhm.
sounds like, just to be safe, because I, have a template with all this boilerplate stuff done, I should just change that to 1 day.
It would probably be safer for you. I mean,
Yeah.
it would be safer. The safest way is to be cognizant of it and know your transaction and know what you're putting yourself into.
Because most sellers don't have the property ready within, sooner than the 5 days or whatever.
Now, remember again, that the verification of property condition is to make sure that the property is in substantially the same condition it was at the time the offer was made, and that any agreed upon repairs have been done. It's not a new home inspection kind of thing. So
Well,
um, just because somebody hasn't moved out of the house and just because somebody hasn't moved all of their furniture out doesn't mean that you can't do a verification of property 5 days prior to close of escrow.
But
or
if you're relying on them to clear like say you asked them in the contract to remove everything and everything's not gone because they haven't moved out yet. So it sounds to me like me as my own practice, I'm going to change that template to 1 day.
Yep.
or if you're already negotiating with the sellers and they're saying, hey, we're going to need a few extra days to move out, say, okay, well then why don't we give you that time to move out, and we're going to put in writing that I'm not going to do the final walkthrough until you're out. Can't you just do that?
Is it after close of escrow?
I mean, I guess it depends, but there's got to be some kind of protection for that, right? So if they are moving out after the close of escrow, let's just say hypothetically, and they need 3 additional days because they need the funds, but then they do something that is damaging to the property, I mean, what in that sense is going to give our buyers protection?
Good question. And there's more, and there's more than one way to skin a cat. Okay, there's more than one way to skin a cat. I don't think that there's any more protection for your buyer to delay the walkthrough until after close of escrow than there is to do the verification of property prior to close of escrow and list the things that are contractually required by the time the seller gets out. So I'll give you 2 scenarios. The seller's not going to move out for 3 days after close of escrow. And so you negotiate, we're doing our verification of property after the seller has vacated the property, and then we will assess whether it's in the proper condition. If you find problems there, you're going to have problems, and the seller's going to have your money. Okay. The other option is to do your verification of property condition 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days prior to close of escrow, and on your form, identify what is not complete. We did our final verification of property. The repairs look like they've been done to the sellers, the way that the sellers have contractually been obligated to do it. The sellers are still occupying the property. Their personal property is there, and the sellers are still contractually obligated to remove their items within 3 days of close of escrow, or they're supposed to remove it at close of escrow. So there's nothing wrong. I guess what I'm saying is there's nothing wrong with doing your VP as it's contractually required, and then writing out the things that are specific that need to be done in order for the seller to meet their obligations to the buyer. Many times there are repairs that have not been complete at the time that the verification is being done, like AB 38 work, or there's a roof repair or something, and you can do your verification and say, hey, everything looks fine. It's exactly the way they said it was going to be, with the exception of all of the AB 38 work is not being done and is supposed to be done within 7 days after close of escrow. And then you would send it off. And if that happened, I would want to get the seller's signature verifying that they received it. That makes sense.
Well, and you could also have escrow hold on to a certain amount of the funds until they're out. And once you get, everything looks good, you could tell escrow to release the funds too, right?
Yes, that's an example of there's more than one way to skin a cat. Lots of different ways to do it. Okay. So I think we beat that one up. Let's go on to the next one that I have, which is down here. Buyer's right to access the property for informational purpose is not a contingency, does not create a cancellation right, and applies even if the contingencies are removed. I scratched my head when I read that because it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If the buyers have a contractual right to access the property informational purpose, but it's not a contingency, what the heck is the use of giving them the right? Because the seller can have a written agreement saying they have the right and then not let them have it. And there's no recourse on that behalf of the buyer. So I thought that was an interesting clause. Okay. But it's not a contingency to the agreement. If the seller does not give the buyer access, the seller or the buyer can't cancel and say, well, you didn't give me access. And I've had real stories with this where we've had buyers, particularly, back in 2020, 2021, when the vacation rental market was hopping and everything was 100% occupied. And we would have a buyer had a lakefront house in escrow. And for the first 17 days, we couldn't do any inspections because the sellers wouldn't let us in it. And then the sellers were giving us notices to perform to remove our contingencies. But hey, you didn't allow us to do anything. So you guys got to be careful about, dealing with that. But know that the contract does not make that access a contingency, and the buyer doesn't have the ability to cancel as a result of it. Okay. Don't think there is a question here. Let me see what that message is.
So does that mean basically on day 18, they no longer have to give access to the property? The sellers?
Yeah, if you leave it blank. Yeah, I mean, if you leave it boilerplate. Yeah, if you leave it boilerplate.
So I'm sorry, I'm hope to not be beating everything to death. But so with that particular clause, if the seller goes into contract with the buyer and then has a backup offer that's better, they can purposely not let the buyer conduct their inspections and then on day 18 cancel. That's what I'm hearing.
I don't know. I don't know that could happen. I mean, I don't know that could happen. That would be an interesting court case, to be involved with. There is a phrase that we'll get into a little bit later that says cancellation rights have to be in good faith, and so we will get to that. So, I mean, there has to be good faith, or, people can get in trouble if they don't operate on good faith. It would pretty clearly demonstrate bad faith if somebody entered a contract allowing people the right to inspect for 17 days, didn't grant them access, and then gave them a notice to perform and then canceled. If a buyer were to take that seller to court and they were to find out that they had a backup offer for more money down the road, I'm pretty sure that a court would find bad faith, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but then you have to go down that whole road. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, sometimes we have to go through roads we don't want to. So removal or waiver of contingency. I thought this was interesting. Any contingency may be removed or waived by checking the applicable box above or attaching a contingency removal form, CRB, and checking the applicable box therein, meaning which contingencies you're removing. Could be appraisal, could be loan, could be, physical condition. But here's where it gets interesting. Removal or waiver at time of offer is against agent advice. See paragraph whatever that is, I can't read it. Okay. So I think what's interesting about that is that most of the time the agent is recommending that the buyer remove that contingency in order to have a chance to get the deal, right? So I think it's really interesting that they have that language in there, because a lot of times if your client does that, if your client removes their contingencies with the intention of getting a deal in a very, very competitive market and things go bad, you're going to have a hard time. You're going to have a hard time proving that this is true. Anybody disagree with me on that? Yeah, I mean, I think that language in there, I don't like that in there. I know why they did it. They're trying to protect the real estate industry, but the reality is that's a lie. Anytime a buyer removes all their contingencies, it's not going to be against our advice. It's probably going to be with our advice and consent to do it. Okay, so I thought that was interesting. The boilerplate now, it used to be 5 o'clock on day of recording. It's upon notice of recording. So if you get confirmation at 11 a.m., possession goes to the buyer at that time. Maybe everybody's already aware of that. I don't know if you're aware of that or not. Okay. Seller occupied or vacant units. There's this, paragraph over here. It says CAR form SIP, seller in possession attached if 29 days or fewer days. CAR form residential lease agreement, seller attached if 30 or more days. It's because tenants have rights, and they're different if it's less than 30 days than if it's more than 30 days. And so if you check one of these boxes and you don't include one of those forms, there's a whole bunch of stuff that, if it ever goes to court, they're going to say, well, why didn't you notify your client of the specifics of that? So you're going to want to make sure you include the proper form if there's a seller staying after close of escrow. And that's even 3 days, by the way. So if seller retains possession for 3 days after close of escrow, you should have the SIP included. Okay. Let's see. Here's a few more timeline deadlines that I think are interesting. Sign and return escrow holder provisions and instructions 5 days after delivery. So, our contract allows for a notice to perform if the buyer doesn't provide the seller or the escrow instructions to escrow within 5 days after delivery. Okay. So if you have a seller that wants to get out of a deal and you're looking for ways to do it, one of them would be to call your escrow officer 5 days after the escrow has been delivered and say, are all of the buyer's papers in? If no, then you can send a notice to perform. If they don't do it within the next 2 days, you can cancel them. Okay. You guys might all wonder, why am I bringing all this stuff up? It's because this is how the contracts work, and this is how you protect your client's interest. Not only can you use it to your seller's advantage at the detriment of an inexperienced buyer's agent, but as a buyer's agent, you want to make sure that an experienced agent on the seller's side doesn't use it against your buyer. That's why these details make sense. Okay, it's important to know. Time to pay fees for ordering HOA documents. This was new to me. Time to pay fees for ordering HOA documents 3 days after acceptance. You accept a deal on Monday. By Thursday, you're supposed to have paid the HOA for the documents. Okay. Time to pay fees for ordering them 3 days. Now this is interesting. Install smoke alarms, CO2 detectors, and water heater bracing. It says 7 days after acceptance. So this contract says if there's no water heater straps and no CO2 detectors and no smoke alarms, they're supposed to be done within 7 days after acceptance. How many people knew that was in the contract? Pays to read it. Okay. I'm being honest with you. I hadn't read it. That's why I highlighted it, because it's new to me. Okay. Evidence of representative authority. 3 days after acceptance. That means if your seller is in a trust or has got a probate thing, or your buyer's a trust or a corporation or an LLC, they're supposed to provide evidence that they have the right to be signing on behalf of that entity. So why is this kind of stuff important? Well, we had one agent in our company that had a listing on a lakefront for a pretty large sum of money back in 2021, I think. And it was a trust, and one of the trust members signed a listing agreement. They got a full price offer a week later, all cash, no contingencies. And the seller said the family decided not to sell it. And the seller's dissent or his argument was, well, I'm only one of, 2 trustees, and not the other trustees didn't sign, so we're not obligated to sell. The seller lost the case. But if the trust, and it wasn't because all of the trustees signed, it was because when he signed the listing agreement, he expressed that he had the legal right to enter into a contract. So it wasn't the trust that was obligated to pay the commission, it was the guy that signed it. You guys follow that? Okay. So this is in this contract so that your seller and your buyer don't enter into a contract, waste 30, 45, 60 days, and at the end find out that the person that signed the listing agreement and signed the contract doesn't have authority to sell the property. That could have saved us that long lawsuit we had, Nicole, that went for 3.5, 4 years. If we would have asked for that, 3 days after close of escrow, that might have saved 3.5 years of litigation. You know what I'm talking about?
Right. I have a question too. So like, I know they used to say, like a husband and wife own a property and the husband signs the listing agreement. Is that all you need still? Or should you get the wife because he technically can't sell it unless she says yes?
There may be new case law, but the general, or the go-to legal answer to that question is that if both owners don't sign, they don't have to sell. They don't have, if both owners don't sign, they don't have to sell. I mean, that's been the legal interpretation. However, the person that did sign owes the commission.
Okay, so they still are obligated to commission if the wife says, why did you put the house up? I don't want to sell it. Okay.
Yeah. That now there may be some new case law where it's been acted on differently, but that's the way it's always been done in the past and always been interpreted in the past.
Okay, I have one more question on that section where it says time to pay fees for ordering HOA. I know that our escrow upfronts fees for that all the time. Is that something that escrow should know, that they have to do it in 3 days if that's
I think the answer to that is yes. Yeah. I mean, if the contract says that it should be ordered within 3 days after acceptance, as soon as escrow gets a transaction that says it's got an HOA and we need documents, that it should be within 3 days.
and then that same thing goes for the evidence of they have the right to sell the property. Escrow should be on that in 3 days, right?
They should be asking for, where's your representative capacity documents? Where's your trust?
Okay.
Usually title is asking for that stuff, sometimes after. I mean, I didn't write this California purchase agreement, so I'm not the one that's going to take the hit for the 3 days. I mean, that seems pretty quick.
Right.
Especially since we don't have a title policy in the first 3 days, and usually the title company is the one that's asking for the trust documents.
And if I could speak to that too, I would say because every escrow is different, like we're really fortunate up here with Mountaintop Escrow and Escrow Plus, but there's been some off the hill escrow companies that have had expectations of me doing something that I've never done before. So I would always say just to, be really cautious and protect our clients, to verify that the escrow company is going to take care of those fees.
Yep. Okay.
Thing for the sign and return escrow holder, that stuff, it says 5 days after delivery. Is that after escrow delivers it to the buyers, then they have 5 days?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Next page, going into the things that are included and excluded. Gosh, can't tell you how many times over the year people have argued about what's a fixture, what's not a fixture. Are the curtains staying? Do the curtain rods stay? Do the mini blinds stay? The TV doesn't stay, but the TV mounts stay and all of that kind of stuff. The good news is that they have highlighted in here just about, I mean, anything that is in the house that your client wants or doesn't want. I mean, you've got this whole box here where you can write in stuff and check boxes. So it's really easy, to negotiate exactly what it is that you want by filling out this area. I think it's important to focus on this area because you have control over it. And later, when we get into some of the boilerplate stuff that's in the back of the contract where it starts explaining, California civil law has what the remedy is. If you don't fill this out, there's language in the back of the contract that the state approves. Okay. So you want to make sure that you fill this part out for your client to get it correct. Next item here, Q2, optional wildfire disclosure report. Is anybody paying for or getting that optional thing that they were charging for? Is anybody doing that at all? I'll bet you guys $100 that starts happening with what just happened, down in Southern California. I'll bet you $100 that's going to start happening. I think what's important about it is that it is not an AB 38 inspection. It's completely separate. The optional wildfire disclosure report is optional. It's not required. And so we've been telling people, go pound sand. We're not paying for it. I have a feeling with, the fire danger, what happened down in LA and the insurance problems that are taking place, that it's going to be more common that those things are asked for and they become part of the transaction that are required.
Yeah, I just got one on an offer that I received yesterday, which we countered out.
Okay. The next one I put in here, Q3, yeah, that'd be a great place to put the AB 38 inspection in here. Also, it'd be a good place to put a termite inspection if you wanted to. Okay. I think here, the only reason that I checked these two here is because we actually do have an issue that is quasi kind of government point of sale is DWP, and their low flow showers and their low flow fixtures and that kind of stuff. So there are some things in here that you might want to pay attention to. Big Bear is pretty safe from a lot of that stuff. But I would think that the DWP thing is something that you want to be pointing out. Okay. Okay, coming down here to the HOA, it comes back to how the costs are allocated. Now, remember is that, those things have to be paid, for, when you're requesting documents within 3 days. I was surprised to see that, the contract says the HOA fee for preparing disclosures is a seller fee. Okay. So, when I go to an HOA and they say, we're selling the property, we want all of your disclosures, we want your financials, we want your rules and regs, we want this and that and the other. Whoever's running the HOA charges a fee for that. Well, that's a seller cost. The seller is paying to provide that to the buyer. The HO certification fee, which is the transfer. I know that there are some HOAs when there is a transfer to a new buyer, they charge the new buyer to approve them. It's basically labor to update their records is what I think it is. That's a buyer fee. If there is a transfer fee that is different, that's negotiable. These other two are not negotiable. So when you talk to your HOA, find out what their terminology is. Is it a disclosure? Is that a fee for preparing disclosures? Is it a certification fee? Is it a transfer fee? What is it? Because if it's not a transfer fee, somebody's being obligated to pay for it. Anybody aware of this, or is this new to everybody? Shake your head if it's new. No? Okay. All right, so let's go on to the next page. Okay. This first part of it here, I thought this was interesting. What they ended up doing is they used to have a mobile home purchase agreement, and they had a commercial with residential and a multi-unit and manufactured purchase agreement, and they had all of these different. They would have a California residential purchase agreement for every single different type of property. Now they have this one contract, and they have these addendas, for each separate thing. So if you fit into any of these, a tenant occupied property, a probate sale, a manufactured home, something in tenancy in common, that is, if your buyers are buying it as tenants in common, which is that's a whole nother class, I think. You would be using these different addendums. I've never done a stock cooperative purchase addendum, so I have no idea exactly what it is. But all of these things, if you have a specific case, you need to make sure that you add these things in here because there are terms in them that are going to be specific to your transaction. For example, your mobile home is going to have a sticker number for the trailer. Mickey, you have a question.
Thanks, Mark. It's regarding item Q3. So I hate to go back. Do you want me to wait till the end, or would you mind going back to Q3, or would you like to wait till the end?
Q3.
Okay. All right. In this scenario, say there's a buyer. It's a fixer property as is from the seller. The buyer is paying for the AB 38 inspection. The buyer is paying for the termites. Shouldn't we keep that out? I'm worried about putting AB 38 and any other kind of inspection report in the contract for instance, if they're getting a loan and the lender requires the AB 38 compliance, but the buyer is going to chop that tree down and rip out that deck anyway, and they don't want the AB 38 work done. Does that make sense?
Well, I see your point. Okay. So the question, so I think what you're saying is that if the buyer is going to do the AB 38 inspection and is going to do the termite inspection under the umbrella of their 17-day due diligence period, why specify it in the contract if it's going to make the lender look hard at it? I think that's what you're
Correct. Yeah.
saying. And the answer is there's nothing that requires it. There's nothing that requires it. You can do it without leaving it, or putting it in the contract. The only thing that I would share with you that could be an issue with that is that, you might be representing the seller, and I might send you a purchase agreement that leaves out the AB 38, and I may leave out the termite inspection and say I'm doing those things and we'll be responsible for it because it's a fixer. And you say, great. And then I go and do them during my 17 days and find out things that I don't like. And I come back to you and say, we paid for the reports, but we're not paying for the work. We want you to do it with a home inspection. So, or with with a repair request, we're going to ask you to do it. So if you don't negotiate it in the purchase agreement that the buyers are responsible for whatever they're responsible for, that means they can always come back and bring it up again later.
So a separate addendum would probably be good for that.
There's more than one way to skin a cat. When I say that, it's true. There's a lot of different ways to make an agreement work. But there's pros and cons to every different thing. If you put it in the contract, then you can hold the other party accountable to it. If you leave it out of the contract, it's still up for negotiation later.
Well, what I'm
Mark-
thinking is that if all you're saying here is who's paying for the report, any repair is a negotiation, regardless of who pays for the report. You could buyers still have that right. Am I correct? And sellers, it doesn't nullify the deal if they come back and either want it or don't want the AB 38.
Well, again, the option is that the buyer, seller, or both can pay for it. If you put an AB 38 in there and you ask the seller to pay for it, you're protecting your buyer. If you are the buyer's agent and you're representing the buyer and the buyer agrees to do the inspection report, remember the seller still has to ask for it.
Right. And I guess best practice is what we're doing, getting that AB 38 as close to when the listing goes live as possible, preferably before.
Yeah. And I value the way that, this conversation is going, because when you have discussions about the contract in different scenarios, you're able to think it through. What are the consequences for checking that box? What's the real life? There's a lot of transactions that we have where people in Ventura or people in Utah, they don't have the same issues that we have, or they don't have the same practices that we have, and they've never run into the exact same problems that we have. So we have solutions for ours if we think it through, and then every time we have a new problem, we have to come up, well, how do I address that in the contract next time? Go ahead, Maureen.
So it seems like if buyers paying for things, you absolutely shouldn't put it in there because it's covered. They can get any inspection they want. It's covered in their 17-day inspection period. So yeah, I don't think you would ever put, only if you're requesting seller to pay it, you put it in there, but not if buyer's paying, because they can get any inspection they want. And if later they decide they want to ask for stuff, it doesn't hurt to ask. Seller can say, no, we already said as is, either cancel or take it as is. So, I don't think we need to really worry about that at all.
Yeah, if the buyer's paying for it, it's probably not beneficial to put in it. It's only beneficial to put that in if the seller's paying for it.
It's been my experience, if you put it in the contract for the seller to pay for the reports and they're getting a loan, then that gives the lender the right to ask for the termite work to be done, to ask for stuff. It's not negotiable, and then somebody's on the hook to get it done.
Yep.
Yep.
Unless you put it in as an addendum, a separate agreement between buyer and seller. So it's still an agreement between the buyer and the seller, but it's not a part of the RPA.
Right, that's what I do.
Yeah.
Very good. More than one way to skin a cat. That's my
So
favorite.
I'm sorry. So do you girls put the AB 38 on that separate addendum as well, or just the termite?
I would put the AB 38, the termite, and furniture on a separate agreement between the buyer and the seller.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let's move on. I've highlighted and underlined here buyer and seller advisories. I thought this was interesting. Why they put this language in here. All advisories below are provided for reference purposes only and are not intended to be incorporated into this agreement. I'd love to ask Gov why they put that language in there. I suspect it's because there was something on an like what we do with our SBSA where we add additional items on there. We've been adding an addendum or language regarding the vacation rental ordinance and and the different things with that, and also with the Zell and some people add on their statewide buyer and seller advisory things about diesel fumes up at Snow Summit, that kind of stuff. I mean, there's all kinds of things that people put in there, and so anything that is added is basically it's saying it's for reference only. It's not intended to be incorporated into this agreement so that people can't sue over those items. That doesn't mean that we're going to leave these blank and not give them out. We're going to still give them out. What that tells me is that a seller and a buyer won't be able to sue each other over the information that's included in these documents, but they'll be able to sue the agents over it. So we want to make sure that we use the appropriate one when we're doing the transaction. Oh, okay. So the next one is really important. Retention of the deposit. So I highlighted the whole paragraph. I'll read it for you. Paragraph 26, if initialed by all parties, so it has to be initialed by all parties or otherwise incorporated into this agreement. If it specifies a remedy for buyer's default, buyer and seller are advised to consult with a qualified California real estate attorney. Okay. They're saying talk to an attorney about the deposit if you agree to the liquidated damages clause. Before adding any other clause specifying a remedy such as a release or forfeiture of deposit or making a deposit non-refundable. So all the time, we're in the middle of negotiation and the buyers are asking for an extension and the seller's major ticked off about it being late. And so they go, well, we'll go ahead and we'll give you this if you make some of the deposit non-refundable, or if you release some of the deposit, or if you did some of that. So, I mean, it's real life. That stuff happens in some of our transactions. But it goes on to say something that's really scary here. It says, before adding any other clause or making a deposit non-refundable for failure of buyer to complete the purchase, any such clause, this is what I underlined, any such clause shall be deemed invalid unless the clause independently satisfies the statutory liquidated damages requirements set forth in the Civil Code. I saw Jess go, what the hell does that mean? Okay. Number one, how many of your people call an attorney whenever they're negotiating these non-refundable things? Very few. Some of them are attorneys, that are talking about it. So I made the decision to call in a California attorney, and sort of went through it. And it's an interesting clause. It's very broad. His take on it is that in residential real estate of 1 to 4 units, the maximum liquidated damages is 3%. Okay, and so his belief is that if you had a transaction for $1 million, 3% of the purchase price is $30,000. And if you ask the seller said, hey, we'll extend the escrow 2 weeks if you release non-refundable $100,000, and the buyer agreed to it. Okay. So if the buyer releases $100,000 to the seller and then 2 weeks later is unable to close, the seller's got his $100,000 and he says, nah, 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 I got your money. See you later. I'm going to go sell it to somebody else. The significance of this clause is that the buyer might have the ability to go back and sue the seller and get $70,000 extra back over the 3%. That's the thought process behind it. That's not a court case. That's the opinion of an attorney, California licensed attorney. So be aware that, there is a little bit of jeopardy in non-refundable or early release deposits. You may get into something really sticky down the road, if that makes sense. Okay. Any questions on that? Jess?
So we just got an offer where they didn't initial the liquidated damages clause. So that basically puts their buyer at risk for not, I just want to make sure I'm understanding correctly. So their buyer is put at risk by not initialing that specific clause.
How does it put them at risk?
Or does it put us at risk? I just don't think I'm understanding fully.
Okay, well, I mean, if the liquidated damages clause is initial, then you have to satisfy the statutory liquidated damages requirements. If the liquidated damages clause is not initial by both parties, then you have no agreement as to what liquidated damages is. One of the scripts that I've used over the years when I've had a buyer saying, well, I don't want to give them, I don't want to initial that 3% liquidated damages clause. And I would say to them, well, what if you cause the seller 50% damage? Do you want them to sue you for 50%? And they go, no. I says, well, if you initial this, then you're limiting it to 3%. Does that sound like a better deal? And they say, yeah, let's go ahead and initial it. Okay. So, in relation to this clause here, if the liquidated damages paragraph is not initialed by all parties, then this wouldn't be valid. And if they released $100,000, there would be, they could sue over it, but it wouldn't have anything to do with the civil code that's cited here. That makes sense. I know this is confusing. I love contract stuff. It's how we protect our clients. Okay. Next phrase I highlighted. I don't know how many people are aware of this, but this question comes up a lot. Buyer authorizes the seller and seller's authorized agent to contact buyer's lender. So it's right here in the contract is that, if you have somebody contacting your buyer's lender, the purchase agreement allows them to do it. So don't argue with them over it because it's right here. Okay. Next one, FHA VA. If the FHA is checked or whatever, we already sort of talked about this before. You're supposed to have the FHA VA, a mandatory clause. It shall be incorporated and signed by all the parties. So it's supposed to be part of the contract, and it shall, within the time specified in paragraph 3E1, deliver to seller written notice of any lender requirements that buyer requests seller to pay for the otherwise correct, or that there are no lender requirements, notwithstanding the seller's agreement to buyer he may obtain. So basically within that 17 days, because that was what the boilerplate number was, if you remember, you're supposed to be providing this information to the seller. Okay. Not a week before close of escrow, at 17 days or whatever you put in the contract. Next one here, limits on credits to buyer. The reason why this stood out to me is I just had this question from my niece that's buying her first home up in North Dakota. My policy when I'm working with a family member is I will refer them to an agent, a local agent in that area. And then when the referral fee comes back, I credit that referral fee towards their closing costs to help them to get into their first home. That's something that I've done with, family members over the years. Well, my niece is in the middle of negotiating on a short sale, and they've asked the seller to pay some of the closing costs to help them. And, their question was, is that going to mess things up? And I said, well, you need to make sure that you know what your lender's mandatory gift contributions are towards your closing cost. Because if the seller gives you 6% and I'm giving you a referral fee on top of it, it says right in here is that, you know, if it exceeds that, the seller has no obligation to pay or satisfy any of the lender requirements unless agreed in writing. So that means if the seller is crediting, you know, 6% and I'm crediting more and the lender won't allow that, there's no requirement that says the seller has to lower the sales price to match it. That makes sense. So you guys want to be aware of that and make sure that you do the math. If you're protecting your buyers that are limited funds and they don't want to waste any of it, do the math with their lender to make sure that the credit that the seller has agreed to pay won't be lost. Okay. I think everybody got that one. Okay. This is an interesting one here. Occupancy. Never really thought about this, but until I read it, is that if you have a seller occupied property after close of escrow, or if you have a tenant occupied property after close of escrow, there's some language in here that says that you should probably check with your lender. You know, because if there's anything in the contract that talks about, you know, somebody occupying the property after close of escrow, it could have some effect on the financing, like down payment. You know, what's the loan to value ratio? Okay. Occupancy may impact available financing. Seller shall disclose to buyer if occupied by tenants or persons other than the seller. That would be a vacation renter, probably more likely than anything else. And then you attach a CAR form, tenant occupied property addendum. Make sense? Anybody ever use this TOPA, tenant occupied property addendum? Okay. So if you have a seller staying in for less than 29 days or less, there's a form for that. If you have a seller staying 30 days or longer after, there's a form for that. If there's a tenant occupied in there that doesn't have a lease agreement that it's subject to, you would be using this TOPA form. Condition of property closing. I think it's important to read through this and make sure that you're aware. I mean, have you guys ever had buyers that come in and there's nail holes after close of escrow and they're hopping mad and pissed off about it? I mean, that language is in here. So it's good to you know, to go in here and read it, because what it says is that the nail holes are supposed to be repaired, but they don't have to be painted. I mean, this language in here is pretty specific. So if your client has specific needs that they want, write them specifically in the offer or on an addendum saying, I want this, and this done, so that it's clear. Don't say all that stuff's in the back of the contract, because if you haven't read it recently, you may be having them agree to things that they don't want to agree to. Okay. Evan has to go. All right. Okay. Contingencies and removal of contingencies. I think this is important. When you have a contingency form to be removing, buyers shall act diligently and in good faith to obtain the designated loans. You know, there's a lot of language, so I'm not going to go through and read all of it, but what it's saying in here is that if you have no appraisal contingency, a lot of people waive their appraisal contingency. They go, you know, I'm waiving the appraisal contingency. And then the appraisal comes in $100,000 low. And then they say, oh crap, I want out of this deal, Mark. How do I get out of it? And some of the agents have said, well, you know, you can't use the appraisal contingency because it came in low. So just tell them your loan was denied. Tell them your loan was denied. They wouldn't make the loan to you. Okay. Anybody have that deal? Because I saw those deals happen, you know, half a dozen times, people trying to get out of deals because of low appraisals. Okay. It's saying in here is that no, that is not going to fly. Got another message. Let's see. Michael is leaving. Okay. So, you know, there's a lot of language in here about the appraisal contingency and how you can't use the loan contingency to get out. just because the appraisal came in low. That's important to know. Going down a little bit further.
I have a question about the appraisal contingency. So obviously the buyer's not protected if the appraisal comes in low, but the seller is protected. So like for instance, the one that I had over on Sugarloaf Boulevard that fell out because the appraisal came in low and the buyers could not come up, financially, there was no way that they could come up to the agreed purchase price. So it ended up canceling, the escrow canceled. So in that case, essentially my client, I represented both. So the sellers could have said, I don't care. We have an agreement. You are still obligated to purchase this property for what we agreed to. Am I understanding that correctly?
Well, no, if the appraisal is a contingency of the agreement, the answer is no. If the contingency for the appraisal has been removed, then the seller's not obligated to lower the price.
I see what you're saying. So like back when it was COVID and people were doing these crazy, like, I'm going to go ahead and remove this contingency right now. And then later on cause a ruckus because I didn't get what I wanted. See, okay.
And that happened a lot. I mean, there were a lot of people that were, and the people that went ahead and bought the property, a lot of them got mad, a year later and came back and sued people for things. So, yeah, crazy markets create all kinds of different things. So, basically the bottom line is if your buyer, leads you to believe that, well, I'm going to waive the appraisal contingency because I want to get the deal. And if the appraisal comes in short, I'm going to try and get out of the deal by calling the loan contingency, out and using that. It's not going to fly. The language in here doesn't allow that to happen. Down here, insurance, this agreement is contingent upon buyer's assessment of availability, approval of the cost of insurance desired under this agreement. I think of all of the challenges that we have in our industry right now, this is the biggest one. I think you guys probably know it. I think it's going to get worse than it is right now. You got to get people looking for insurance, from day one, and try and button that up. Okay. And maybe put in longer than 17 days in your purchase agreement so they have more time to shop for it. Okay. This is a huge one that I want to point out for you guys. Items included in or excluded from MLS. The reason why this stood out is I had a real situation with this. There was a time 20 some odd years ago, maybe longer, that I sold a house over on North Shore that was painted red. And on the back half of the property, there was a red shed. It looked like it was exactly the same color as the house. It looked like it was part of the house, and it was a bank repo. There was a lock on it. The bank didn't know anything about it. And mistakenly, stupidly, whatever, I assumed that it was part of the property. So I put in the MLS that there's this 2-bedroom, 1-bath cabin. It's got a shed on the back of the property. And we ended up selling the property. And, come to find out after close of escrow, the shed was not on the property. It was on the neighbor's property. Yeah. Okay. So, the buyer took, the buyer took me to the board and complained for misrepresenting in the advertising, and the board gave me a letter of warning for it, because I didn't verify it. And then he took me to small claims court. Let me finish the story, Jess, because I may answer. So then the buyer took me to small claims court, and he came in with binders and made this big presentation about how I'd misrepresented and everything else, blah, 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 blah. And by this time I'd gotten a little bit smarter. And so I brought the purchase agreement to the judge, and I said, well, here's the deal. I said, it says right here in the purchase agreement that this property is sold without any personal property, without warranty. There's no sheds, there's no this, there's no that, blah, 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 blah. It was in the bank. The bank saved me. The bank saved me by writing in their counteroffer that there was no personal property, no shed, no furniture, no nothing. It was the real estate only. And so the judge said, even though the MLS had information in it that was incorrect, shame on you, Mark, you screwed up. that I was not legally required to buy him a new shed because it was excluded from the contract and the buyer had signed it. That's what this clause says right here. Anything that's in the multiple listing service, flyers, marketing materials, or disclosures that are not included in the purchase price are not warranted. So if the purchase, if the flyers say there's a hot tub included and the contract says it's excluded, the contract wins over what's in the MLS. This is a big win. This is a big win for us real estate people that offer stuff and don't, and it's not accurate at the time of close of escrow. But it also makes writing your contracts even more critical than they've ever been before, because you're going to be held by what's in the contract, not what's in the MLS. Make sense? When you're representing a buyer, it's important to know what's in the MLS ain't going to matter. It's going to be what's in the contract. Okay. Worth the price of admission there. Okay. Item excluded from sale. This is about personal property. And remember, I talked to you about all those boxes about checking what you wanted and what you didn't want. It says otherwise, unless otherwise agreed. So if you leave that entire box up at the top blank, this is what's going to happen. The following items are excluded from the sale. All items specified in paragraph, you left it blank. So audio and video components are excluded, such as TVs, speakers, and other items. If any such item is not itself attached to the property, even if a bracket or other mechanism attached to the component or item is attached to the property. Furniture and other items secured to the property for earthquake or safety purposes. So if you have a bookcase that is secured so it doesn't fall down for earthquake, doesn't have to stay. I mean, there's language in here that if you haven't read it, man, you're going to find out you're reading it for the first time when you go to court. That's not going to be fun. So I recommend that you guys read this stuff so you know exactly what's there. Okay. How many people have you ever seen that actually secure their furniture to the wall for earthquakes? Very few, right? Okay, Jess has seen some of that. Okay. Reinspection fee, we've seen this added to contracts for a long time. It basically says if the seller doesn't prepare everything in time for inspections and there's a recharge that the seller's paying for it, that's what this whole clause is here. Remember, if you go back to that first page where it said you're supposed to have the smoke detectors, water heaters, and CO2 the devices, they're supposed to be installed within 5 days after or 7 days after. Well, I mean, if there's an appraisal and there's a reinspection fee, the seller's responsible for it. So you don't have to add it in. It's already in the purchase agreement. Nothing on the next page. Nothing on the next page. We're getting close. Okay, here's cancellation. Time periods for removal of contingencies. I think everybody knows this, but I want to repeat it again. Any removal of contingencies or cancellation have deadlines. And it used to be that, you could cancel, give them a notice to perform and cancel them right away. And they put a lot of time periods for protection in here. So basically what's happening now is that if you are giving a notice to perform, you have a 2-day minimum waiting period. Where did I put that? I don't think here's the good faith. Removal of contingencies, cancellation rights. The following time periods may only be extended, altered, or modified or changed by mutual written agreement. Any removal of contingencies or cancellation under this paragraph by either buyer or seller must be exercised in good faith and in writing. Good faith and in writing. Okay. So if you are really tricky and you're not operating in good faith, you could get into trouble. I hesitate to share this story too much or to go into too much detail because it didn't happen all that long ago. But I was in a position where I had a seller that had a backup offer $100,000 higher than what he was in escrow for. And in order to, I had a fiduciary duty to the seller, but not the first buyer. And I had a fiduciary duty to the second buyer, which made it very, very, very sticky. So my duty to the first buyer is to be fair and honest. So when we get to the point where contingencies are supposed to be removed, my job is to tell the other person, hey, your contingency is supposed to be removed, in 3 days. We need you to remove that. And the person says he doesn't want to do it, so we give him a notice to perform. What I didn't do is I didn't pressure that person and say, hey, look, we have a backup offer for more money. If you don't reduce or if you don't remove the contingencies, you're going to lose the deal. Because I had a fiduciary duty to my seller, which if I would have done that and kept the first buyer in the deal, it would have cost my seller $100,000. And if I did that to the other agent, it would have harmed a buyer that I had a fiduciary duty, the right to step in and purchase a property. So sometimes what you don't say to people is just as important as what you do say, right? Everybody follow that? So in good faith, okay, in representing my seller, I gave fair and honest communication to the agent and the buyer that I didn't represent, but I didn't share with them privileged information that would harm my fiduciary duties to my clients. They ended up, getting canceled, and the second buyer moved into place and bought the property. And the buyer came back and claimed lack of good faith. Do you know what saved me? Who can guess? Written communication. So every single time I had a conversation with the agent on the other side of the transaction with the first buyer, I would send him a follow-up email, summarizing what we had talked about and asking him when they were going to remove the contingency. I never said in the email, we have a backup offer for more money and we're going to cancel you if you don't, because I wasn't going to harm my client's position. But I was fair and honest with him, and I documented all of those conversations and asked them to respond. Very, very important, okay? Because when that first buyer came back and said you didn't operate in good faith, my attorney wrote a letter and said, here's all the examples of the communication between our agent and yours, and you failed to perform. Right? Okay. So it's important that you document what you're doing. Okay. It's important that you do the right thing, but that you document it too, because if I hadn't documented it, it would have been he said, she said all the way around. And so my documentation put into writing what we talked about. Okay. Let's see. Continuation of contingency. I think you all know this. Continuation of contingency. If you have a 17-day due diligence period and the contingency is not removed on day 17 or 18 or 19, the contingency remains. The contingency remains until it's removed. Okay. The seller can give a notice to perform and try and force your hand on it. The last line in here is important. It says the seller may not cancel this agreement based on the contingency after it's been delivered. So if they're asking you to remove a contingency for the loan and it goes late, let's say that it was a 21-day contingency period and they don't remove it until 30 days. Well, after the 30 days when it's removed, the seller can't cancel because you were late. Does that make sense? He can't cancel you because you were late. Once the contingency is removed, it's done. There's no ability for the seller to hold you accountable for that. Yep, Jess.
Sorry, I've got so many questions. Okay, so however, if the seller obviously gives the buyer's agent the notice to perform 3 days prior to that, then the seller could cancel. If the seller does not initiate a notice to perform, then it just remains active until that point. Okay, just wanted to clarify.
And I think we're going to get to that here. Where are we getting to that? Maybe where I didn't do, where does it say? Notice or to buyer or sellers to perform. Okay, I didn't go over this. Notice to perform as a 2-day minimum. So if you have a 17-day due diligence period, you can't send it on day 1. You can't send it on day 3. You can't send it on day 7. You have to send it 2 days prior. Okay, so if you have a 17-day due diligence period, send it on the 15th day. Okay, if you want to be ahead of the game. You can always wait 17 days, but if you send them a notice to perform, that's going to automatically extend their contingency period to 19 days. Okay. Depending on, every transaction's different. There's more than one way to skin a cat. You just have to know how to use the contracts to accomplish what you're trying to do for your clients. The demand to close is not 2 days, it's 3. And what was happening is that, people would drag on an escrow for, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 7 weeks, 10 weeks, or whatever. And finally, the seller would be absolutely livid. And they would have issued a notice to perform 3 weeks earlier and it didn't happen. And then all of a sudden they would just cancel out of the blue. They'd finally lose it. Well, CAR and the attorneys and everything said, let's not let that continue. So they put in a 3-day period. So if you have a close date, contractual close date, and your seller wants it to end, on the day, send it 3 days prior to close. But you can't send it more, you can give them more than 3 days, but you can't send it more than 3 days in advance. Okay. You can say, we're going to give you 5 days to close, and then we're going to cancel. We demand that you close in 7 days, but you can't send it early and you can't make it you can't say we give you 1 day. Make sense? Okay. So we talked about, okay, this part here. This is for all of the people that argue over deposits. That buyer did me wrong, held me up, wasted my time. I'm not going to release that deposit back to him. Right here, a party may be subject to a civil penalty of up to $1,000 for refusal to sign cancellation instructions if no good faith dispute exists as to which party is entitled to the disputed funds or deposited funds. Note, neither agents nor escrow holder are qualified to provide any opinion on whether either party has acted in good faith or which party is entitled to the deposited funds. Buyer and seller are advised to seek the advice of a qualified California real estate attorney regarding the matter. So this is important because I know all of you guys get into this situation from time to time because I got into it a lot, is that you should probably go to your client and point this out to them. And if your buyer thinks that the seller is unreasonably doing it and the deposit amount is less than what's available in small claims court, they can go to small claims court. If it's more than small claims court, this $1,000 penalty isn't going to pay for the attorney fees to go to court, if that makes sense. But this is the remedy. So you can point this out to a seller or a buyer if they're unreasonably, if the buyer breached completely and they're not entitled to the deposit and they say, well, I'm not giving it to the seller, blah, 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 point this out to them. Okay. And then say, contact an attorney. Okay. So we have, you guys are going to like this one at the very bottom of this page, 11 of 17. And believe me, we don't have to go through every page here. Third party beneficiary. Remember at the beginning, I said, you're not a party to the contract. You're not a party to the contract. However, the seller acknowledges and agrees that the buyer's broker is a third-party beneficiary of this agreement and may pursue the seller for failure to pay the amount specified in this document. So if the seller agrees to pay you 2.5% in this contract and doesn't pay you, the buyer-broker agreement makes the buyer responsible for it. But if it's negotiated in this contract, you can go directly to the seller to get it. That's going to be a good bit of language for you to talk with your buyer when your buyer's concerned, saying, well, what if the seller doesn't pay you? This buyer broker agreement says that I'm responsible for paying you. I don't want to sign that. Can you guys see that happening? I can. Okay. Well, that's why this clause here is so important, is it says, hey, we're going to negotiate a deal where the seller agrees to pay my fee. And if the seller agrees to pay the fee, I don't come after you. I can go after the seller for failure to pay if he fails. Okay.
Hey, Mark.
Yes, sir.
Up at the top of the page, you have the notice for the buyer to perform and then the demand to close escrow. Do you have to do both of those? Do the notice to perform and then a cancellation?
Well, there's two different purposes. I mean, you could do both, but let's, a notice to perform is to is to force the hand of somebody that's not meeting their contractual obligation. If you're at day 19 and you have a 45-day escrow, you can't demand them to close. You can only demand that they do the next indicated contractual obligation, which is remove their contingencies or, remove their appraisal contingencies. So, you can issue the notice to perform for those things at day, you could issue those things at day 7 if they haven't returned their escrow instructions, if you really wanted to be a butt for it. The demand to close is not something that you're going to be sharing until the contractual close date. So let's say you have a 45-day close of escrow and you're in the middle of a delay with the loan, and you say to the buyer, I'm going to give you a notice to perform. I want you to remove all your contingencies, which makes your deposit at risk. I want you to remove all your contingencies. And let's say that the buyer says, okay, I'll remove my loan contingency too, because I want to stay and protect myself from the deal. The buyer can do that even though they don't have loan approval, right? They can. Okay, it's risky, but they can. Doesn't mean they will very often, but they can. So you give the notice to perform to remove the contingency. You could tell the buyer, I'm willing to extend the escrow as long as you remove your loan contingency. Put your money where your mouth is. You're saying you need an extra week to close. Put your money where your mouth is. Put your deposit at risk. And if you do that, I will go ahead. And if the buyer says no, I'm not removing the contingency because I'm not going to put my deposit at risk, you as a seller can then turn around and say, okay, I can demand to close. We were contractually supposed to close last week. You got 3 days to close. Now the buyer will, or the seller will never get the deposit that way, but at least they'll be able to cancel and move on without wasting any more time. Make sense? Is there any more question on that I missed? Okay. Hearing none, we'll move on. A couple of pages of nothing. Good, I like that. Liquidated damage, all that stuff is pretty much the same that we've talked about. So we're here at the end. We're here at the end, and here's what I wanted to talk with you about. I had a really interesting thing yesterday. And I'll go to that at the end. If you check this box where it has an entity buyer, it's important that you put information in here, put it in here correctly, okay? When you check this box, you do not have to use an RCSD. On a listing agreement, when you check the box, you don't have to use an RCSD because you're putting the information that is in the RCSD actually in the contract. Well, when you have an RCSD and it's a buyer, let's say that the buyer is an LLC. The buyer is the LLC. But LLCs cannot sign for themselves. It has to be a person. It has to be a person. Only human beings can sign documents. LLCs cannot sign. LLCs can be buyers. Trusts can be buyers. Corporations can be buyers. But none of them can sign a contract. It has to be an authorized person that signs on their behalf. And that's what the RCSD is. It's a representative capacity. It says that I'm the manager for the LLC. I'm the president of the corporation. I'm the trustee for the family trust. Okay. So if you fill that out here correctly, full entity name, Dolan Trust of 2020, you put in the name of the trust. Okay, or the probate number or whatever, you fill out, what is the entity? You put it in here. And then you identify who the signer is and you put the name. The name of the legally authorized signer is or are, and you put the name of the people that are actually going to sign. Then when you come down to the buyer's signature, the printed name of the buyer is the Dolan Trust of 2020, and the signature is by Mark Dolan, trustee. Guys follow that? I think, and I still see issues with that all the time. So what was interesting about the one that I got yesterday was that title was held by a trust. It was a family trust, and the signer was a corporate entity. It was a professional trustee company that was the signer. So we had, Joe Smith Living Trust, and the signer was XYZ Corporate Trustee. And then we had Mickey Dolans was the signer for the corporation that was acting as the trustee. Does that sound really complicated? So what we did on the contract is we had the name of the trust put in, and that was put in here. And then the legally authorized signer was the corporation. And then we created an RCSD for the corporation that said, hey, the legally authorized signer is XYZ Corporation, but the person that's going to be signing for that is Mickey Dolans. And so we had Mickey Dolans' name in here, and we had the name of the trust. So there was a chain of who the people are and who the entities are that are signing on the behalf. There is a lot of corporate shell games that go on with highly sophisticated investors. I've only seen it a couple of times. This was not a this was a family trust that had a corporate trustee. But there are some pretty high level, sophisticated investors that will have a corporation and they'll set up LLCs underneath it, and then they'll have signers, and it's pretty complicated. So if you get anything like that, here's the two things to remember. An entity can be the buyer, an entity can be the seller, but the signer has to be a real live human being. And the real live human being has to have some legal capacity for the entity, either as a manager or a president or a certified financial officer or something. That's what you have to have. Make sense?
Can I
So,
add to that a little bit?
yep.
What we see as auditors all the time is, can you go back to that page, or I can use this one right here, where it says printed name of buyer. What happens a lot is people put the name of the person selling it, but then if you look at the box below, it says printed name of legal authorized signer. You wouldn't have John Smith and John Smith, right? It wouldn't make sense.
Yeah.
The printed name of the buyer is
buyer's-
John Smith Trust, dated whatever, whatever. Printed name of legal authorized signer is John Smith. And I
Correct.
know agents get upset with auditing staff all the time because we reject it. And they go, no, the signer is John Smith. And I'm like, I understand that, but think about it. You can't have, why would they put that right there? It just makes sense to me. They wouldn't have two lines saying John Smith.
Yep. Good point. Good point. Okay, so let's see. Nothing there. Last thing on here, just to make sense, if you leave this blank, but you have your email address in here, that means that this is the email address. I think this is a change. I mean, I think before you had to actually put an email address in, but now if you leave this blank, the email that's up here is going to be the designated electronic delivery address. So, I mean, I can leave this blank and I can put that up there. And if they send me an email, that means they've delivered the document to me. If I don't want it to come to this email and I want it to go to a transaction coordinator, I can put in the transaction coordinator's email here to change it, if that makes sense. If there's multiple parties, you can do this, other form. I really don't want to get involved with adding extra paperwork if I can get away with it. So hopefully you can get by with one or two of these different things here. So, are there any questions? I think I've talked you guys' ears off. You guys are probably sick and tired of hearing me. This is an hour and a half. Hopefully it was helpful for you. Are there anything that I didn't go over that you guys have a question about? Then I'm batting 1,000. I must have answered all of your questions. I'm pleased with that. So I appreciate you all coming. I think I'm going to talk with Dana, about some different things that we're talking about doing. I think going through a different contract on a regular basis. The easiest way to become an expert in this business is to know the contracts back and forth. I remember watching, 25 years ago or so, there was a a TV show. It was the millionaire real estate agent when $1 million property was a big deal. It was the company was down in Florida. And I remember watching one of the episodes where they had forgotten to check a box and it cost their client 100 grand. And I remember the team leader of the team was all ticked off because his staff had not done the contract properly and cost their client $100,000, and his reputation was everything. That team's reputation was everything. So looking forward to sharing more information with you guys as things go forward. And with that, I will shut up.